The elderly man clutched his service dog's vest with trembling hands, his breathing shallow and erratic as the crowded terminal seemed to close in around him. "I'm sorry, sir, but we don't allow pets in the cabin. You'll need to check the dog or take another flight," the airline agent announced loudly, ignoring the clearly visible service animal certification and the veteran's increasingly panicked expression. But they had no idea who was watching this unfold from the jetway, or what was about to happen when that cockpit door swung open and the pilot stepped into the terminal, his captain's hat tucked under one arm, revealing a face marked by the same war that had left scars no one could see. What connection did this airline captain share with the struggling veteran that would change everyone's understanding of sacrifice? Type respect and subscribe to our channel if you believe no hero should ever stand alone. Marcus Holloway's fingers dug deeper into Ranger's vest as curious onlookers turned to stare. The German shepherd pressed firmly against his leg, sensing his handler's distress growing by the second. The cacophony of the busy airport terminal announcements, blaring overhead, rolling suitcases clicking against tile, hundreds of conversations merging into a deafening roar, was already pushing the limits of what his fractured mind could process. "Sir, I've explained our policy," the gate agent repeated, her voice rising with impatience. "Emotional support animals need to be properly documented, and—" "He's not an emotional support animal," Marcus managed, his voice barely audible. He fumbled in his pocket, producing a worn leather wallet. With shaking hands, he retrieved a laminated card. "Ranger is a service dog. PTSD service dog, military certified." The agent barely glanced at the documentation before pushing it back across the counter. "I'm sorry, but without proper airline-approved documentation filed at least 48 hours in advance, I can't allow the animal on board. Those are the rules." Marcus felt his chest tightening. The fluorescent light suddenly seemed too bright, pulsing with the same cadence as distant explosions. Sweat beaded on his forehead as the terminal began to swim before his eyes. "Please," he whispered. I can't be separated from him." An older woman in line behind Marcus stepped forward. "Young lady, that's a service dog vest. Clearly marked. You can't separate them." "Ma'am, I'm handling this," the agent responded curtly. "Sir, you have two options. Check the dog with cargo or take another flight and complete the proper paperwork beforehand." Marcus felt the first tremors beginning in his hands. Ranger immediately responded, pressing his weight more firmly against Marcus's leg and looking up with alert brown eyes. The dog had been trained to recognize the early signs of a panic attack. "Down," Marcus whispered to Ranger, who immediately sank to the floor, providing the pressure therapy he'd been trained for. Marcus lowered himself to one knee, placing a hand on the dog's steady flank, trying to ground himself as the terminal seemed to recede into a tunnel of noise. Somewhere in the distance he heard murmurs. "What's wrong with him? Probably drunk. Why, do they always make a scene?" A child pointed. A teenager snickered. A businessman sighed dramatically, checking his watch. The gate agent's voice cut through. "Sir, you're holding up the line. I need you to make a decision now." Marcus's mouth went dry. The last time he'd been separated from Ranger during a flight, a well-meaning flight attendant had insisted the dog move from under his feet during turbulence. He'd suffered a breakdown, so severe that the plane had to make an emergency landing in Denver. 3 days in a psychiatric hospital followed. His VA psychiatrist had been clear, "Don't fly without him, not yet." The trembling spread to his shoulders. His vision tunneled. Further, the edges darkening like the approaching sandstorm that had preceded the worst day of his life. His breathing came in short, ragged gasps. Ranger whined softly, licking his hand, trying desperately to pull his handler back from the precipice of a full-blown episode. I have documentation," Marcus tried again, his voice breaking. "Right here, please." The agent sighed. "Sir, I've made myself clear. This documentation isn't sufficient for our airline. Now, please step aside so I can help the next customer." Marcus felt himself slipping further away. The terminal walls seemed to morph into the mud brick buildings of Kandahar province. The rolling suitcases transformed into the rumble of approaching vehicles. The fluorescent lights flashed like mortar fire. Ranger barked once, something he was trained to do only when his handler was in serious distress. The last thing Marcus registered before the flashback took him completely was the cold voice of the gate agent calling for security and the burning shame of once again becoming a spectacle, a broken man unable to perform the simple task of boarding an airplane, just another veteran whose wounds were too invisible to warrant compassion. Captain James Reeves completed his pre-flight checklist with practiced efficiency, his weathered hands moving across the instruments with the same precision that had once field-stripped an M4 carbine in pitch darkness. 22 years of commercial. Flying after 15 years in the Air Force had made the Boeing 737 cockpit as familiar to him as his own living room. "Weather's clear all the way to Chicago," First Officer Liu commented, adjusting the air conditioning. "Should be smooth sailing today?" James nodded, his mind already drifting to the retirement paperwork waiting on his desk at home. 6 more months of flights, then a life of fishing and woodworking stretched before him. Some days he welcomed it. Other days, like today, the thought hollowed him out. Another transition, another identity to shed. The cockpit phone buzzed. James picked it up, expecting the usual boarding update. "Captain, we have a situation at the gate," the lead flight attendant, Sandra, reported. "Passenger with a service dog. Gate agent's giving him trouble about documentation." James frowned. "What kind of service dog?" "PTSD, I think. Veteran. He's not doing well." Gate agent called security. Something in Sandra's tone made James pause. In his peripheral vision through the small cockpit window, he caught a glimpse of the jetway entrance. A small crowd had gathered, spectators to someone else's suffering. "I'll be right there," he said, standing abruptly. Liu looked up in surprise. "Captain, we're scheduled to push back in 20 minutes. "Keep working the checklist," James replied, already removing his headset. "This won't take long." As he stepped ablaze out of the cockpit, James felt a familiar tightness in his chest, the same tension that had accompanied him in hundreds of missions over hostile territory. He'd learned to recognize the feeling. Something was wrong, and he needed to assess the situation. The lead flight attendant met him at the cockpit door. "It's getting worse out there, Captain. The passenger is on the floor now. Some kind of episode." James nodded, his face impassive. "I'll handle it." He made his way down the jetway, the sounds of distress growing louder as he approached the gate. The scene that greeted him triggered an immediate response, honed by years of combat triage. Identify the vulnerable, assess the threat, establish control. A man was kneeling on the terminal floor, a German shepherd pressed against him. The dog's posture was unmistakable to James. Not a pet, but a working animal doing exactly what it had been trained to do. The man's hunched shoulders and rapid breathing were equally familiar signs. The gate agent stood behind her counter, arms crossed defensively. 2 airport security officers hovered uncertainly nearby, clearly unsure how to proceed. Passengers formed a loose circle, most keeping their distance, while a few recorded the scene with their phones. James felt a surge of cold anger. He'd seen this before, the public spectacle of a veteran in crisis, treated as entertainment rather than the fallout of service and sacrifice. As he stepped forward, his gaze locked on the veteran's 1,000-yard stare. In that vacant expression, James recognized more than generic trauma. There was something hauntingly familiar about the man's features, something that tugged at memories James had spent years carefully compartmentalizing. The way the man's left, hand splayed against the floor for support, the particular angle of his hunched shoulders, the scar just visible along his hairline. James felt the world slow around him as recognition dawned. Not a face from his commercial flying career, but from before. Desert fatigues, night operations, a helicopter extraction gone wrong. "Sandstorm 6, James whispered to himself, using the old call sign. Memories cascaded through his mind. The frantic radio calls, the blinding dust, the sound of incoming fire. For a moment, James was no longer standing in an airport terminal, but kneeling in scorching sand, shouting orders as tracer rounds cut through the darkness around them. the taste of grit in his mouth, the weight of responsibility for the men under his command. He blinked the memory away, focusing on the present crisis. Whether this was indeed the same soldier from that night or just someone who triggered the recollection didn't matter now. What mattered was that a veteran was suffering, and no one was stepping up. James straightened his uniform jacket and strode forward with purpose. His career might be winding down, but some duties never expired. Some bonds remained sacred long. After the uniforms were hung up, "Stand down," he said quietly to the security officers as he passed them. "I've got this." 5 minutes earlier, James had been completely focused on his pre-flight routine. The decision to leave the cockpit had come instinctively, without conscious deliberation. Now, as he stood at the threshold between jetway and terminal, he felt the weight of multiple responsibilities pulling him in opposite directions. Behind him, 173 passengers, a schedule to maintain, company protocols. Before him, a veteran in crisis, a system failing him, a moment demanding intervention. James touched the captain's bars on his uniform. The airline had strict policies about crews becoming involved in gate disputes. Captains were expected to remain in the cockpit during boarding, focused on flight preparations. Passenger issues were the domain of gate agents and customer service representatives. "Captain Reeves?" First Officer Liu's voice crackled through his handheld radio. "Ground called. They're asking about our pushback status." James keyed the radio. "Tell them we might have a slight delay. I'll update you shortly." "Sir, is everything okay? Should I call operations?" "Negative. Stand by." James clipped the radio back to his belt. The scene before him had deteriorated further. The veteran was now fully curled around his service dog, his breathing audible, even from a distance. The security officers had moved closer, uncertainty written across their faces. One had his hand on his radio, likely calling for medical assistance or additional security. James knew the playbook for these situations all too well. The veteran would be escorted from the terminal, probably in handcuffs, for his own safety. The dog would be taken by animal control. The flight would depart without them. Incident reports would be filed. Everyone would move on, everyone except the veteran. A memory surfaced, James sitting alone in a military transport aircraft after his third tour, trembling uncontrollably as the engines spooled up. No one had intervened then. No one had recognized what was happening to him. He'd suffered silently, ashamed, convinced his weakness would end his career if discovered. Only later, after a particularly bad episode during survival training, had a flight surgeon pulled him aside. "This isn't weakness, Captain," the doctor had said. "This is your brain processing what your spirit wasn't meant to endure." James had gotten help, quietly. He'd recovered enough to transition to commercial aviation, to build a life after combat. But he never forgot the isolation of those early struggles. His radio crackled again. "Captain, operations is asking if there's a problem." The gate agent reported a disruptive passenger situation. James made his decision. "Tell operations I'm assessing a potential passenger medical situation," he replied. "I'll handle the paperwork if we push back late." He knew what this might cost. A delay on his record, questions from management, possibly even disciplinary action if he overstepped. 6 months from retirement, he could simply turn around, return to the cockpit, and let the situation resolve itself without his intervention. The company would certainly prefer that approach, but there were older obligations that superseded company. Policy, promises made in desert nights, a code that remained long after uniforms were exchanged. James straightened his tie and stepped fully into the terminal. The crowd parted instinctively before his captain's uniform, creating a path to the kneeling veteran. As he approached, James noted the dog's vest more clearly. "Service dog, do not separate from handler," was embroidered alongside military patches. The animal maintained perfect discipline despite the chaos, fulfilling its training with quiet dedication. The gate agent spotted him, and her eyes widened. "Captain, we have this under control. This passenger is being—" James held up a hand, silencing her mid-sentence. 22 years as captain had perfected his command presence. When he spoke, people listened. "I understand there's an issue with a service animal," he said, his voice calm but carrying authority that reached every corner of the gate area. "Captain Reeves, this isn't a cockpit matter," the gate agent replied, visibly flustered by his intervention. "This passenger doesn't have the proper documentation for his animal, and he's becoming disruptive." James noted her name tag. "Ms. Chen, I'd like to review the documentation myself." "Sir, with all due respect, we're running behind schedule, and I'm aware of our schedule," James interrupted, his tone remaining measured. "And I'm still the captain of this aircraft. The safety and well-being of everyone on my flight is my responsibility. That includes ensuring we're complying with service animal regulations correctly." He turned his attention to the security officers. "Gentlemen, I appreciate your response, but I'd like a moment with this passenger." The officers exchanged glances, clearly weighing the captain's authority against their instructions. "We were called about a disturbance," one began uncertainly. "And I'm addressing it," James replied. "Stand by, please." He took another step toward the veteran, whose trembling had intensified. The dog looked up at James, alert but not aggressive. James knew his next move would likely determine the outcome for everyone involved. James crouched down, maintaining a respectful distance from the veteran and his service dog. He kept his movements slow and deliberate, the way he'd approached wounded soldiers in the field. No sudden gestures, no looming presence. Just one man bringing himself to eye level with another. "Staff Sergeant Holloway?" he asked quietly, the rank and name emerging from the recesses of his memory. The veteran's head snapped up, his eyes wide with confusion and lingering panic. Recognition didn't immediately register on his face, but the use of his rank seemed to pull him partway back to the present. Yes, Staff Sergeant Marcus Holloway," he managed, military training briefly overriding his distress. "Who?" "Captain James Reeves," he replied, then added more softly, "Air Force, 41st Rescue Squadron, Kandahar, 2009. The fog in Marcus's eyes began to clear. He studied James's face, searching for connections across the years. "Sandstorm 6, James added. "Night extraction under fire." Marcus's breathing hitched. The service dog sensed the change, pressing closer to his handler. Around them, the terminal continued to buzz with activity, but a small bubble of shared understanding had formed between the two men. "Captain Reeves," Marcus whispered, recognition dawning. "You were the pilot, the one who came back." James nodded once, memories cascading through him with crystal clarity. The mission had been straightforward. Extract a special forces team pinned down in a village 30 clicks from base. 4 men, including then Sergeant Holloway. But nothing in Afghanistan was ever simple. They'd been hit by heavy ground fire on approach. Sandstorm conditions, limited visibility, his co-pilot critically wounded. James had been forced to retreat, leaving the team exposed. Standard protocol would have dictated waiting for conditions to improve and backup to arrive. But James had heard the desperation in the team leader's voice over the radio. He'd made a different call. "I went back for my men," James said simply. He'd returned alone in a second helicopter, executing a near-impossible landing in blinding sand while taking fire from 3 directions. He'd held position as Holloway and his team fought their way to the aircraft, one man being dragged, already gone. They'd escaped by mere seconds, the helicopter taking multiple hits during ascent. The official report had called it exceptional airmanship. James had received a distinguished flying cross that he kept in a drawer, never displayed. What he remembered most was the blood coating the helicopter floor and the eyes of the men he'd retrieved, that particular 1,000-yard stare that never completely faded, the same look Holloway had now. "You came back when no one else would," Marcus said, his voice steadier now, anchored by the shared memory. "We thought we were dead." The service dog, sensing his handler's shift from panic to intense focus, adjusted his position but remained vigilant. James noted the animal's exceptional training, a living medical device more sophisticated than any pharmaceutical intervention. "Looks like you've got good backup these days," James said, nodding toward the dog. "Ranger," Marcus supplied. He keeps me here, present." A flash of distress crossed his features. They want to separate us. Say his papers aren't right." James stood slowly, turning to face the gate agent, while keeping himself positioned between her and Marcus, creating a protective barrier. The crowd of onlookers had grown, passengers pretending to mind their own business while surreptitiously watching the drama unfold. "Ms. Chen," James called, his voice carrying the calm authority that had guided crews through turbulence and mechanical failures for over 2 decades. "I'd like to see the service animal documentation that was presented." The gate agent's expression tightened, but she slid the papers across the counter. James reviewed them carefully, noting the official Department of Veterans Affairs letterhead, the service dog certification, and the medical necessity verification. "These appear to be in order," he stated. "Company policy requires submission 48 hours in advance through our online portal," she countered. "Plus, we need additional verification for psychiatric service animals versus guide dogs." James felt a familiar heat rising in his chest, the same controlled anger that had fueled him through 3 combat tours. He'd seen this before: bureaucracy, weaponized against the vulnerable, rigid adherence to policy without human judgment. "Ms. Chen, I'd like to speak with your supervisor," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Captain, we're already behind schedule. This passenger can take the next flight if he completes the proper—" "Your supervisor," James repeated. "Now." He turned back to Marcus, who had managed to rise to his feet, one hand still firmly gripping Ranger's vest. The dog maintained perfect position, a living anchor to reality. "Staff Sergeant," James said quietly, "you're flying with me today." The gate supervisor arrived within minutes, a harried woman in her 50s, with the weary expression of someone who had seen every possible airport drama unfold. Her name tag read, "Patricia Moore, Customer Service Manager." "Captain Reeves," she began, glancing at his uniform insignia. "I understand there's an issue with a service animal?" James maintained his position between Marcus and the airline staff, his posture relaxed but unmistakably protective. Ranger remained vigilant at Marcus's side, the dog's training evident in his calm but alert demeanor. "Ms. Moore, we have a veteran with proper service animal documentation being denied boarding," James stated. "Staff Sergeant Holloway's paperwork is in order. His service dog is essential medical equipment." Patricia frowned, quickly scanning the documents James handed her. "I see the issue. These are government certifications, but our airline requires our specific forms to be submitted in advance. The Air Carrier Access Act specifically states that airlines cannot require documentation for service animals beyond assurance that they're trained service animals and necessary for the passenger's disability," James countered. "Those requirements have been met." The supervisor's eyebrows rose slightly. "You're quite familiar with the regulations, Captain." "I make it my business to understand the laws that affect my passengers, especially fellow veterans," James replied evenly. Around them, passengers had begun recording the interaction on their phones. James noted this but continued undeterred. "Ms. Moore, Sergeant Holloway, was awarded the Bronze Star with Valor Device for actions that saved American lives. The least we can do is follow federal law regarding his service animal." Patricia lowered her voice. "Captain, I appreciate your concern, but this isn't your jurisdiction. Flight deck and cabin safety are your domain, not gate operations. With respect, ma'am, the well-being of everyone boarding my aircraft is absolutely my jurisdiction." James replied, matching her quiet tone but adding steel to his words. "And I'm telling you that separating this veteran from his medical equipment would create an unsafe situation for him and potentially others on board." Marcus stood silently behind James, one hand still firmly gripping Ranger's vest. His breathing had steadied, but James could sense the fragility of his composure. The public confrontation was taking a toll. "The dog doesn't have the proper—" Patricia began. "Service dogs don't require airline-specific documentation," James interrupted. The 2021 Department of Transportation ruling clarified this. Service animals are defined as dogs individually trained to work or perform tasks for people with disabilities. That definition is met here. The supervisor pursed her lips, clearly weighing the growing public relations problem against policy adherence. Several passengers had moved closer, their expressions ranging from curiosity to open support for the veteran. "He was having some kind of episode," she noted. "We need to ensure he's fit to fly." James nodded, a valid concern. But his reaction was triggered by the threat of separation from his service animal, a threat that violated both federal regulations and basic human decency. A murmur of approval rippled through the onlookers. Someone whispered, "The captain's right." Patricia glanced at her watch, then at the growing crowd. "Captain Reeves, may I speak with you privately for a moment?" James hesitated, unwilling to. "Leave Marcus alone." "It's okay," Marcus said quietly. "Ranger's got me now." James followed Patricia several paces away, maintaining a line of sight to Marcus. "Look," she said, her professional mask slipping slightly. "I understand what you're doing. My brother served 2 tours in Iraq, but there are procedures." "There are also laws," James countered, "and moral obligations that supersede corporate policy. We're already 20 minutes behind schedule," she noted. "Every minute costs the airline thousands." "And what's the cost of abandoning a veteran who's already paid an immeasurable price?" James asked quietly. "What's the PR cost when videos of this incident hit social media? Airline denies decorated veteran service dog access isn't a headline your company wants." Patricia sighed, rubbing her temple. "You're putting me in an impossible position, Captain." "No, ma'am. Your gate agent did that when she denied valid documentation and called security instead of seeking clarification on regulations." A moment of silence stretched between them as Patricia considered her options. Finally, she nodded. "Fine. The service animal can board, but you're taking responsibility. For this passenger, Captain, any issues in flight are on you." "Gladly," James replied without hesitation. They returned to where Marcus stood with Ranger. The veteran's posture had improved slightly, shoulders straighter, chin lifted. The presence of an advocate had visibly bolstered his resilience. "Sergeant Holloway," Patricia said formally, "we apologize for the confusion. You and your service animal are cleared to board." Relief washed over Marcus's face. "Thank you," he managed, his voice thick with emotion. James placed a steady hand on Marcus's shoulder. "Let's get you seated before the rest of the passengers board. First class has more room for Ranger." "But I'm in economy." "Not today," James said. "Consider it a long overdue upgrade." James guided Marcus and Ranger down the jetway, intentionally slowing his usual brisk pace. The narrow passage with its muted lighting and humming ventilation system created a transitional space, a buffer between the chaos of the terminal and the confined environment of the aircraft. "Deep breaths," James said quietly. 4 count in, 6 count out. Marcus nodded, recognizing the standard anxiety management technique taught to military personnel. Ranger padded silently beside him, the dog's body language mirroring his handler's. Gradual return to steadiness. "Been a while since I had a senior officer run interference for me," Marcus said, attempting humor, though his voice still carried the ragged edge of recent distress. "Not an officer anymore," James replied. "Just another guy trying to do right." They paused before reaching the aircraft door. James turned to face Marcus directly, lowering his voice further. "Before we board Hollow, do you remember what we used to call the safe zone back in Kandahar?" Marcus's brow furrowed briefly, then cleared. "Green deck," he answered. "When the LZ was secure for landing." James nodded, satisfied. "This aircraft is green deck. You understand? My aircraft, my rules." "Copy that," Marcus replied automatically, military shorthand returning naturally after all these years. "Good man. Your job is to focus on breathing. Dog's job is to keep you grounded. My job is everything else. Clear?" "Clear," Marcus confirmed, his posture straightening almost imperceptibly. As they boarded the aircraft, the lead flight attendant approached. Sandra Hayes had flown with James for nearly a decade and recognized his serious expression immediately. "Everything okay, Captain?" she asked, eyeing Marcus and Ranger with professional assessment. "Staff Sergeant Holloway and his service dog will be in 2A, James stated. "Upgrade authorized by Gate Supervisor Moore." Sandra nodded, understanding. The unspoken directive. "Of course, would you like pre-departure service, Sergeant Holloway?" Marcus shook his head. "Just water, please. And maybe some space." "Absolutely," she replied, stepping back to give them room to pass. James led them to the first-class seat, positioning Marcus by the window with Ranger at his feet. The spacious legroom accommodated the service dog perfectly. "I'll be right back," James said. "Need to finish pre-flight checks." As he turned to leave, Marcus spoke. "Captain, about what happened back there?" "Nothing happened," James interrupted firmly. "Nothing worth mentioning." The silent understanding passed between them, the unspoken covenant among those who'd seen the same darkness. Some experiences existed beyond civilian translation, beyond incident reports and formal acknowledgement. James made his way back to the cockpit where First Officer Liu waited with barely concealed curiosity. "Everything sorted, Captain?" Liu asked. "All good," James replied, settling back into his seat. "Let's run the pre-start checklist again." Liu nodded, professional enough not to press for details. They worked through the procedures methodically, the familiar routine grounding James after the confrontation. Meanwhile, in the cabin, other passengers had begun boarding. Marcus kept his gaze fixed out the window, focusing on Ranger's steady presence against his legs. The first-class cabin filled with business travelers, most casting curious glances at the service dog before settling into their seats. Across the aisle, an older man in a worn Vietnam-era Marine Corps cap caught Marcus's eye and gave him a subtle nod. Behind him, a middle-aged woman in an Army National Guard sweatshirt paused briefly, her hand brushing Marcus's shoulder. As she passed, a silent gesture of solidarity. One by one, the veterans among the passengers made themselves known through these subtle signals. No words exchanged, no explanations needed, just the quiet acknowledgement of shared experience across different wars, different eras. Sandra returned with water for both Marcus and Ranger, setting a small bowl discreetly on the floor. "Captain Reeves asked me to give you this," she said, handing Marcus a business card. On the back, James had written, 41st RQS, "These things we do, that others may live," the motto of the Air Force Rescue Squadrons. Marcus ran his thumb over. The embossed words, a tangible reminder that he wasn't alone, hadn't been forgotten. The realization sent an unexpected wave of emotion through him. Ranger immediately pressed closer, sensing the shift. "He's good," Marcus told Sandra, nodding toward the cockpit. "The captain, he's good people." "One of the best," she agreed. 22 years, never seen him step off the flight deck during boarding like that. Whatever happened back there must have been important. Marcus didn't reply, but his expression softened. The panic that had nearly consumed him at the gate felt more distant now, replaced by a different kind of intensity, the weight of being seen, truly seen after years of invisibility. Outside, ground crews completed their work. In the cockpit, James finished the pre-flight communications with the tower. Throughout the cabin, passengers settled in for the journey ahead, most unaware of the drama that had nearly derailed their travel plans. For Marcus, though, something fundamental had shifted. In a world that had grown increasingly indifferent to his struggles, someone had remembered. Someone had recognized not just his needs, but his worth. As the engines spooled up, Ranger rested his head on Marcus's foot, perfectly positioned, vigilant, but calm. The dog's training and instincts created a bubble of safety in an environment Marcus had once thought unbearable. He closed his eyes and breathed. The aircraft reached cruising altitude, the gentle hum of engines creating a white noise backdrop that lulled many passengers to sleep. But for Marcus, the sound triggered something else entirely. Memories of another flight, another time. Kandahar's Province, 2009. The mission had started routinely enough. Marcus and his Special Forces team had been tasked with gathering intelligence from a village elder believed to have information about Taliban movements. 4 men, a 12-hour operation, in and out before dawn, standard procedure. But intelligence had been wrong. The village wasn't just sympathetic to Taliban forces. It was actively housing a significant cell. The team had walked into an ambush. Staff: Sergeant Marcus Holloway, Staff Sergeant Eric Davidson, Sergeant Mike Townsend, and Lieutenant Christopher Allen found themselves pinned down in a mud brick compound surrounded on 3 sides with their exfiltration route cut off. Sandstorm 6, this is Dagger Team. We are taking heavy fire. Request immediate extraction, Lieutenant Allen had radioed, his voice tight but controlled despite the rounds impacting inches from his position. Marcus remembered the response crackling. Through their comms, Dagger Team, this is Sandstorm 6, weather conditions deteriorating, visibility near zero, hold position. They'd held for 3 hours as the firefight intensified. Townsend took a round to the shoulder, their ammunition dwindled. And then Lieutenant Allen made the call they'd all been dreading. Sandstorm 6, situation critical. We cannot hold position. Requesting immediate extraction regardless of conditions, authorization code Delta 79er. The code meant one thing: extract us or we die here. Marcus closed his eyes, the aircraft cabin fading as the memory intensified. He could still feel the grit of sand between his teeth, the weight of his rifle, the copper smell of Townsend's blood. As he applied a pressure dressing to the wound, the reply had come back. Dagger Team, Sandstorm 6 inbound. ETA 8 minutes. Pop smoke on my signal. They'd looked at each other in disbelief. Helicopter pilots didn't fly in sandstorms. The risk was too great. Yet someone was coming for them. What followed was chaos. Davidson went down, a round catching him in the thigh. Allen took command of their defensive position, while Marcus dragged Davidson behind cover. Townsend, despite his wound, maintained suppressive fire. Then came the distinctive thrum of helicopter rotors, barely audible above the M. Gunfire. Can't see for shit, Allen muttered, squinting into the swirling sand. How's he going to find us? The radio crackled. Dagger Team, I need that smoke now. Make it purple. Allen hesitated. We pop smoke, we give away our exact position. If we don't, he flies away, Marcus had countered, already reaching for the smoke grenade. The purple plume had barely begun spiraling upward when the Taliban fighters intensified their assault, recognizing the extraction attempt. Rounds pinged off the compound walls, forcing the team lower. Through the haze of smoke and sand, Marcus glimpsed the helicopter, a lone Black Hawk descending directly into the hot zone, taking fire from multiple positions. It was either the Ikaisid, bravest or most foolhardy piloting he'd ever witnessed. Move! Now! Allen ordered. Marcus and Townsend had dragged Davidson between them, making for the helicopter as Allen provided cover. 20 meters of exposed ground felt like 20 miles. The Black Hawk hovered impossibly steady despite the conditions. It's Dr. Gunner laying down suppressive fire that gave them precious seconds to close the distance. 10 meters out, Allen took a hit. Went down hard. Man down, Marcus shouted, already changing direction. Leave him. Get to the bird, Allen called back, his voice strained. Marcus ignored the order. He handed his portion of Davidson's weight fully to Townsend and sprinted back. Toward Allen, rounds kicking up dust at his feet. The helicopter pilot's voice cut through their comms. 30 seconds? Then I must lift. Marcus reached Allen, assessed the wound, stomach bad, and hoisted him over his shoulders in a fireman's carry. The lieutenant's blood soaked through Marcus's gear as he staggered toward the helicopter. 5 meters from safety, Marcus felt the impact, white-hot pain tearing through his side. He stumbled, but didn't fall. Couldn't fall. Allen would die if he fell. Somehow he reached the helicopter, hands pulling them both aboard. The aircraft immediately began to ascend, still taking fire. Through a haze of pain and adrenaline, Marcus saw the pilot's helmeted profile, steady hands on the controls as the Black Hawk banked hard and accelerated away. Davidson was screaming. Townsend was applying pressure to Allen's wound, and Marcus pressed his own hand against his side, blood seeping between his fingers. Hang on, the pilot's voice came through their headsets. Medical standing by, 10 minutes out. But Lieutenant Allen didn't have 10 minutes. He died somewhere over the desert, his blood pooling on the helicopter floor, despite their desperate efforts to save him. In the end, 3 men came back from a 4-man mission, 1 in a body bag, 2 on stretchers, and 1 pilot who had risked everything to bring them home. The memory dissolved as the aircraft hit a pocket of turbulence, jolting Marcus back to the present. Ranger immediately sensed his distress. Placing his head on Marcus's knee and applying gentle pressure across the aisle, the Vietnam veteran watched with knowing eyes. He'd seen his own version of that desert night in a different time, a different war, but the weight of memory, that was the same. The aircraft had been in the air for 40 minutes when Sandra appeared at Marcus's seat, her professional smile tinged with concern. "Sergeant Holloway, the customer relations manager, would like a word with you. She's on the phone from headquarters." Marcus tensed, his hand automatically finding Ranger's head. The dog immediately pressed closer, sensing the shift in his handler's demeanor. "Am I in trouble?" he asked quietly. Sandra shook her head. "No, but there's been communication from the ground about the boarding situation. Captain Reeves asked me to bring you the phone in the galley for privacy." Marcus nodded and stood, Ranger moving smoothly to heel position. They followed Sandra to the forward galley where she handed him a handset. "Sergeant Holloway speaking," he said, his voice automatically assuming the formal tone ingrained by military service. "Mr. Holloway, this is Diane Webster, Senior Manager of Customer Relations at Transcontinental Airlines," came a clipped professional voice. "I understand there was an incident regarding your service animal at the gate today." Marcus swallowed. "Yes, ma'am, there was some confusion about his documentation. I've reviewed the report filed by our gate staff," Webster continued. "It indicates you became agitated when asked to follow our service animal procedures. I presented valid documentation," Marcus replied, fighting to keep his voice steady. "My service dog is medically necessary for PTSD management. Our policy requires specific forms to be submitted 48 hours in advance," Webster stated. "The gate supervisor made an exception in your case, but I want to be clear that this deviation from protocol was extraordinary and not to be expected in the future." Marcus felt heat rising in his face. Ranger pressed his weight more firmly against his leg, the pressure a silent reminder to breathe. "Ma'am, with respect, your gate agent rejected documentation that complies with Department of Transportation regulations. The Air Carrier Access Act specifically prohibits airlines from—" "Mr. Holloway," Webster interrupted, "I'm not calling to debate policy. I'm calling because Captain Reeves interfered with standard gate procedures, and I need to understand the circumstances more fully." Before Marcus could respond, the handset was gently taken from him. James had emerged from the cockpit, his expression calm but determined. "Ms. Webster, this is Captain Reeves," he said. "I authorized Sergeant Holloway's boarding in accordance with federal regulations which supersede company policy when the two are in conflict." Marcus watched as James listened, his face betraying nothing. After a moment, the captain spoke again. "With respect, ma'am, I'd suggest reviewing the 2021 DOT final rule on traveling by air with service animals before pursuing this matter further. Transcontinental's current policy requiring submission of forms 48 hours in advance is not compliant with federal guidelines for service animals." Another pause. James's expression hardened slightly. "Yes, I understand company policies are important, but so is compliance with federal law. And as captain, my primary responsibility is the safety and legal rights of all passengers aboard my aircraft." He listened briefly. "Yes, I'll submit a full report upon arrival. Thank you for your concern." James handed the phone back to Sandra, who returned it to its cradle with a barely suppressed smile. "Everything okay, Captain?" she asked. "Just fine," James replied. "Corporate catching up to regulatory changes as usual." He turned to Marcus. "Sorry about that. Webster's by the book, but ultimately harmless. Don't worry about it." Marcus nodded, relief evident in his posture. "Thank you. Again." "Don't mention it," James said, then added more quietly, "Ever serve with a Lieutenant Christopher?" "Allen?" Marcus stiffened, the name hitting him like a physical blow. "Yes, sir. He was our team leader. Didn't make it back from that extraction." James nodded, his expression solemn. "I know I was flying that night." The simple statement hung in the air between them. All the pieces suddenly fit into place for Marcus. why this pilot had recognized him, why he'd intervened so decisively. "You're the reason any of us made it home," Marcus said, his voice barely audible over the aircraft's ambient noise. James shook his head slightly. "Just doing my job." "Same as you were, sir. I never got to—" "First Officer Liu is handling the flight deck," James interrupted. "I'm going to grab coffee. Join me?" Marcus understood the deflection for what it was. Some conversations were too heavy for a galley standing room, too personal for a commercial flight. He nodded and followed James to the jump seat area where they could speak with relative privacy. "Alan was a good officer," James said, pouring 2 cups of coffee. "Made the right call, asking for extraction despite conditions." "He died believing that," Marcus replied. "Kept saying we'd make it out, right until the end." They sipped their coffee in silence for a moment, the shared memory creating a bubble of understanding in the busy aircraft. "After that night," Marcus finally said, "things were never the same. Davidson recovered physically but took a medical discharge. Townsend stayed in, transferred to training. I tried to keep going, did another tour, but—" He gestured vaguely to Ranger. "Some wounds don't close clean," James nodded. "I grounded myself for 2 weeks after that mission. Couldn't sleep. Kept seeing Alan's face, wondering if I could have been faster. Steadier, better. You were perfect," Marcus said firmly. "What? You did? Coming alone like that, it was beyond anything we could have expected." "Not alone," James corrected. "My co-pilot took rounds through the side window during the first approach. That's why I had to pull back initially. He survived, but barely. The revelation hung between them. Another piece of the story Marcus had never known. News of the confrontation at the gate had traveled through the aircraft like wildfire. Passengers who had witnessed the scene firsthand shared details with their seatmates, who passed the story further back. By mid-flight, most of the 173 souls on board knew some version of what had transpired. Marcus returned to his seat after speaking with James, Ranger settling at his feet once more. The Vietnam veteran across the aisle caught his eye. "They giving you trouble about your battle buddy there?" he asked, nodding toward Ranger. Marcus hesitated, then shook his head. "It's sorted now. Shouldn't have been an issue in the first place," the older man said. "Name's Frank Delgado, Marine Corps 68-70. Marcus Holloway, Army Special Forces, Afghanistan." Frank nodded, the generational gap between their service eras irrelevant in the face of shared experience. "That dog's doing exactly what my buddies did for me in the jungle, keeping you anchored when the world goes sideways." "Yes, sir, that's exactly right," Marcus replied, surprised by the perfect analogy. "I saw what happened back at the gate," Frank continued. "Reminded me of how things were when we came home. Different war, same bull." He glanced at a child seated nearby. Same problems. A woman in the row behind Frank leaned forward. "My husband has a service dog too. PTSD from Iraq. The things he goes through just to travel." She shook her head. "I'm Elena Wilson, by the way." More passengers joined the conversation, their voices low but intent. A retired nurse described her work with Vietnam veterans. A young man mentioned his brother's struggles after 3 tours in Afghanistan. An elderly woman spoke of her late husband's nightmares that never faded, even decades after Korea. What had begun as idle chatter evolved into something more significant, a spontaneous community forming around shared understanding of what service and sacrifice truly meant. "Did you see how that gate agent treated him?" a businesswoman whispered loudly to her companion, "like he was trying to sneak a pet on board, not dealing with a medical necessity." "Happens all the time," another passenger replied. "My niece has an invisible disability. The looks she gets using handicapped parking." Marcus felt simultaneously exposed and supported. Ranger sensed the complexity of his emotions, maintaining steady pressure against his leg while remaining alert to any signs of distress. A flight attendant passed by, pausing as she noticed the growing conversation. "Everything okay here?" she asked, her tone professional but kind. "We're fine," Frank answered. "Just having a little veterans reunion." The flight attendant smiled. "Captain Reeves wanted me to check on you, Sergeant Holloway. Anything you need?" Before Marcus could answer, A man in a tailored suit, 2 rows ahead, turned around. "I need to know why my flight was delayed for nearly 40 minutes, he said, his voice carrying the entitled edge of frequent business travelers. "Some of us have connections to make." An uncomfortable silence fell over the section. The flight attendant's smile tightened. "Sir, I can check on your connection when we're closer to landing." "That's not what I asked," the man persisted. "I want to know why this flight departed late. Was it because of him?" He gestured toward Marcus and Ranger. Frank Delgado straightened in his seat, his weathered face hardening. "Watch yourself, son." "I'm not your son," the businessman retorted, "and I have a right to know why my schedule was disrupted." Elena Wilson leaned forward. "Because sometimes things matter more than your schedule, like making sure a veteran can travel safely with his medically necessary service animal." "Look, I support the troops as much as anyone," the man said defensively, "but rules exist for a reason. If everyone brought their emotional support animals—" "Service animal," corrected multiple voices simultaneously. "There's a difference," Elena added firmly. The businessman's face flushed. "Whatever. The point is, procedures exist. Exceptions cause delays. Delays affect everyone." An older woman across from him lowered her book. "Young man, my herald served in Vietnam. Came home to people spitting on his uniform. Suffered nightmares for 40 years because of what he gave for this country." Her voice quavered but remained strong. "If Captain Reeves delayed this flight to ensure that young Sergeant was treated with the dignity he deserves, then I'd happily miss a dozen connections." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the cabin. The businessman looked around, realizing he'd misjudged his audience. He turned back in his seat without another word. Marcus felt a complex mixture of emotions: embarrassment at being the center of attention, gratitude for the support, and a subtle loosening of something tightly wound within him. These strangers were standing up for him, validating his experience in a way that felt both foreign and desperately needed. The flight attendant caught his eye and gave him a reassuring smile before continuing her duties. Ranger, sensing the shift in his handler's emotional state, relaxed slightly against Marcus's leg. Frank leaned across the aisle. "See that? Times are changing, son. Slowly, but they're changing." Marcus nodded, unable to fully express what the moment meant to him. After years of fighting invisible battles alone, of explaining his needs and being dismissed, of carefully navigating a world that often seemed designed to trigger his worst symptoms, this simple act of collective understanding felt like a revelation. For Avo, the first time in longer than he could remember, Marcus felt something unfamiliar unfurling in his chest: hope. James returned to the flight deck, settling back into the captain's seat with practiced ease. First Officer Liu glanced over, curiosity evident in his expression. "Everything okay with our special passenger?" he asked, adjusting the altitude slightly. As they navigated around a pocket of turbulence. "He's good," James replied, running through his instrument checks. "Better than he was on the ground." Liu nodded, letting the subject drop. They'd flown together long enough that he knew when James wasn't inclined toward conversation. The cockpit settled into comfortable silence, broken only by routine radio communications and the steady hum of the aircraft systems. 20 minutes later, the satellite phone buzzed. James picked it up, expecting another call from customer relations. "Captain Reeves," he answered. "James, it's Michael Bradford." James straightened involuntarily. Michael Bradford was Transcontinental's chief operating officer, not someone who typically called flight crews directly. "Sir," James acknowledged, switching to speaker so Lou could hear the conversation. "Protocol for cockpit communications, I understand there was an incident at the gate involving a passenger with a service animal," Bradford said, his tone measured. "Diane Webster briefed me on the situation." James met Lou's surprised glance. The COO getting involved in a gate dispute was unprecedented, yes, sir. A veteran with PTSD was being denied boarding with his properly documented service dog. I intervened to ensure compliance with federal regulations regarding service animals. Webster mentioned that, Bradford replied. She also said you cited specific DOT regulations to her. The 2021 final rule on traveling by air with service animals, James confirmed. It clearly states that airlines can't require documentation to be submitted 48 hours in advance for legitimate service animals. A pause stretched over the line. James, how long have you been with Transcontinental? 22 years, sir. And prior to that, 15 years Air Force, 41st Rescue Squadron. Another pause. I thought I recognized your name. You received the Distinguished Flying Cross, didn't you? Afghanistan 2009? James shifted uncomfortably. Yes, sir. My son served 2 tours in Afghanistan, Bradford continued, his voice softening slightly. 82nd Airborne. Came home different. Has his own service dog now. The revelation hung in the air. James waited, sensing there was more to this call than a reprimand about gate procedures. The passenger in question, Staff Sergeant Marcus Holloway. James supplied. Special Forces, Bronze Star with Valor device. Was he on that mission? The one that earned you the DFC? Yes, sir. His team. I didn't recognize him immediately, but when I did, you had to intervene, Bradford finished for him. I would have intervened regardless, James said firmly. But yes, the connection made it personal. Bradford's sigh was audible over the line. Webster's concerned about precedent, about captains leaving the flight deck during boarding to override gate decisions. I understand her concerns, James replied. But with respect, sir, our current service animal policy doesn't align with federal regulations. This isn't the first time we've had this issue. Lou raised an eyebrow, impressed by James's directness with the COO. Elaborate, Bradford requested. Our policy still treats psychiatric service animals differently from other service animals requiring advanced documentation. The 2021 DOT rule eliminated that distinction. All trained service animals must be treated equally, regardless of what tasks they perform. Another extended silence followed. James could almost hear the mental calculations happening at the other end of the line. You're retiring soon, aren't you, James? Bradford finally asked. 6 months, sir. That's what your file says. Exemplary. Record. Not a single customer complaint in over 2 decades. 14 commendations for exceptional handling of in-flight emergencies. Bradford paused. And now you're risking a disciplinary note in your file weeks before retirement review. James straightened. Sir, with respect, I didn't see it as a risk. I saw it as my duty. Liu glanced at James with newfound respect, clearly impressed by his captain's willingness to stand his ground with the COO. I've asked legal to review our service animal policies against current DOT regulations, Bradford said after a moment. Preliminary feedback suggests you may be right about the inconsistencies. Relief washed through James, though he kept his expression neutral. Thank you, sir. Don't thank me yet, Bradford cautioned. Webster still wants this documented as a procedure violation, says making exceptions undermines our gate staff's authority. I understand her position, James replied, but I would make the same decision again. Bradford's chuckle surprised him. I believe you would. That's why I've taken this call myself. A pause. My son's dog is named Atlas, changed his life, got him out of the house again after 2 years of barely leaving his bedroom. Sergeant Holloway's dog is named Ranger, James offered. Remarkably well-trained animal. They usually are, Bradford agreed. James, I'm going to handle this personally. No disciplinary action. But I would like your input on updating our service animal policies. An email with your thoughts would be appreciated. Of course, sir. And James, thank you. Not just for today. For 2009 as well. Men like my son came home because of men like you. The line went dead before James could respond. He replaced the handset slowly, processing the unexpected turn of events. Liu let out a low whistle. Did the COO just ask for your advice on company policy? Appears so, James replied, still somewhat stunned by the conversation. And no write-up for leaving the flight deck during boarding. James shook his head. Apparently not, Liu grinned. Captain, in all my years of flying, I've never seen anything like this. You must have some serious guardian angels in the executive suite. Not angels, James corrected quietly, just the right passenger on the right flight. He turned back to his instruments. But his mind remained on the conversation. For years, he'd kept his military service separate from his commercial career. The Distinguished Flying Cross stayed in its drawer. The memories remained carefully compartmentalized. His colleagues knew he'd served, but few knew the details. Now those worlds had collided in unexpected ways, and somehow the sky hadn't fallen. The cabin lights dimmed as the flight continued eastward. Many passengers dozed or watched movies on their screens. Marcus remained awake, his thoughts drifting back to that night in Afghanistan and the days that followed. After the extraction, he'd spent 3 weeks in a military hospital in Germany. The bullet that had struck him during the final dash to the helicopter had torn through his side, missing vital organs, but causing significant blood loss. Physical recovery came steadily. The psychological aftermath proved more complex. Lieutenant Allen's death weighed heavily. As team leader, Allen had been respected, even revered. Only 28, with a quiet competence that inspired confidence. Marcus had carried his bloodied body onto that helicopter, felt the exact moment when life left him. Some nights, he still did. Ranger shifted at his feet, repositioning himself to maintain contact with Marcus's leg. The dog's training allowed him to sense even subtle changes in his handler's stress levels, responding before full-blown symptoms could manifest. Frank Delgado had fallen asleep across the aisle, his Vietnam veteran's cap pulled low over his eyes. Elena Wilson was reading, occasionally glancing over with a sympathetic smile. The bubble of unexpected support remained, even in silence. Marcus closed his eyes, not to sleep, but to practice the grounding techniques his therapist had taught him. 5 things he could see: Ranger's ears, the overhead bins, his hands, the window, the seat fabric. 4 things he could touch: the armrest, Ranger's fur, his seatbelt, the water bottle. 3 things he could hear: the engine hum, distant conversation, the air circulation. 2 things he could smell: coffee, Ranger's familiar scent. 1 thing he could taste: mint from his last gum. The exercise helped, but memories continued to surface. After Germany, he'd been transferred to Walter Reed. Davidson was there too, still recovering from his leg wound. They shared a room for 6 weeks, barely speaking. What was there to say? Allen was dead. Townsend had been reassigned. Their team, their brotherhood, was fractured beyond repair. Marcus remembered the day Allen's personal effects were shipped home to his parents. A flag folded precisely. A collection of letters never sent. A small notebook filled with observations about his men, their strengths, their quirks, their potential. Marcus had discovered later that Allen had recommended him for officer candidate. School, noting his exceptional judgment under pressure and natural leadership qualities. The recommendation died with Allen, and something in Marcus died too. He'd tried to continue, completed physical therapy, passed the psychological evaluations, telling the doctors what they needed to hear rather than the truth. Returned to active duty with a new team, new dynamics, new missions. But the night terrors intensified. Hypervigilance became his default state. The sound of helicopters, once a promise of safety, of extraction of home, triggered episodes of uncontrollable panic. His new team members noticed, covered for him when possible, but in Special Forces, there was little room for compromise. After a training exercise went badly wrong, Marcus diving for cover at the sound of a backfiring vehicle, compromising their position, his commanding officer had pulled him aside. "You're not okay, Holloway," he'd said bluntly, and pretending otherwise puts lives at risk. The medical discharge followed. Anxiety disorder with post-traumatic features, a clinical phrase that failed to capture the reality of his condition. The military had taken a focused, disciplined operator and returned a fragmented civilian to society, equipped with combat skills, but lacking the ability to navigate a shopping mall without breaking into cold sweats. The VA helped eventually. After months of bureaucratic hurdles and waiting lists, he'd connected with a psychiatrist who specialized in combat-related PTSD. Dr. Winters had seen beyond the diagnosis to the man beneath, understanding that Marcus hadn't lost his strength. He'd lost his context, his framework, his brothers. The bonds formed in combat are neurologically different from civilian relationships, she'd explained. Your brain literally rewired itself to depend on your team for survival. When that structure shattered, especially with Alan's death, your nervous system lost its primary regulation mechanism. Her insights had made sense of his fragmented experience. The treatment plan had been multifaceted: medication to manage the most severe symptoms, therapy to process the trauma, and eventually, Ranger. The service dog program had been experimental then, especially for psychiatric support rather than physical disabilities. Marcus had been skeptical at first. How could an animal replace what he'd lost? But Ranger wasn't a replacement. He was something entirely new. The German Shepherd had been trained specifically for PTSD support, sensing anxiety escalation before Marcus himself was aware, providing deep pressure therapy during episodes, creating protective space in crowded environments, and perhaps most importantly, offering unconditional presence. Ranger didn't care about Marcus's diagnosis, didn't see him as broken or damaged, simply responded to his needs with consistent, unwavering support. Marcus opened his eyes, glancing down at the dog. Ranger immediately looked up, alert to his handler's attention. The simple exchange, this silent communication with a creature who understood his needs without words, had become his lifeline. "Good boy," Marcus whispered. Davidson hadn't been so fortunate. Last Marcus heard, he was living in his parents' basement in Ohio, rarely venturing out. Townsend had stayed in, burying his grief in work, transferring to a training role that kept him perpetually busy. Neither had found their Ranger, their bridge back to functionality, and the pilot who'd saved them, who'd risked everything to bring them home, had been just a helmeted figure in Marcus's memory. Until today, Captain James Reeves, the man who came back when protocol said to stay away, the man who'd opened the cockpit door when another veteran needed rescue of a different kind. The flight was 2 hours into its journey when Sandra, the lead flight attendant, approached Marcus's seat with a tablet in hand. "Sergeant Holloway," she said quietly, mindful of passengers trying to rest, "I have someone who would like to speak with you." Marcus looked up in surprise. Ranger shifted at his feet, alert but calm. "It's our regional director," Sandra explained, offering the tablet. "She's on a video call." Marcus accepted the device with confusion. On the screen was a middle-aged woman in a corporate office, Transcontinental Airlines logo visible on the wall behind her. "Sergeant Holloway, I'm Regina Matthews, Regional Director of Customer Experience for Transcontinental," she began. "I want to personally apologize for your experience at our gate today." Marcus blinked in surprise. "Ma'am? The treatment you received regarding your service animal was inconsistent with both our values and federal regulations," she continued. "I've been briefed on the situation by our COO, Mr. Bradford, and want to assure you that we're taking immediate steps to address the gaps in our service animal policies and staff training." Marcus glanced toward the cockpit door, understanding immediately that Captain Reeves must have been involved in this unexpected development. "Thank you, ma'am," he managed. "I appreciate that. Additionally," Matthews continued, "we'd like to offer you our sincere apologies in the form of a travel voucher and permanent notation in your customer profile to prevent any similar issues in the future." Frank Delgado, who had awakened and was unabashedly listening to the conversation, gave a soft whistle of approval. "That won't be necessary," Marcus began, uncomfortable with special treatment. "It's already done," Matthews said firmly. "It's the least we can do." She paused, her professional demeanor softening slightly. "My brother served in Iraq, 10th Mountain Division. I understand, at least somewhat, what you've been through." The personal disclosure caught Marcus off guard. He nodded, unsure how to respond. "One more thing," Matthews added. "Captain Reeves mentioned you might be willing to consult with us on improving our service animal policies and staff training. If you're interested, we'd value your input as both a veteran and a service dog handler." Marcus stared at the screen, momentarily speechless. For years, he'd been forced to navigate systems that weren't designed for his needs, to explain and justify and advocate for basic accommodations. The idea that his experience might actually help change those systems was both foreign and profoundly appealing. "I'd be honored," he said finally. "Excellent. I'll have my office contact you after your flight. And again, please accept our sincere apologies." With a professional nod, she ended the call. Marcus handed the tablet back to Sandra, who was smiling broadly. "I've never seen Regional get involved like this," she confided. "Whatever Captain Reeves said must have made quite an impression." As Sandra moved away, Frank leaned across the aisle. "Now that's something you don't see every day. Corporate bigwig falling all over herself to apologize." "I'm as surprised as you are," Marcus admitted. Elena Wilson, who had been listening from the row behind, spoke up. "You shouldn't be surprised. What happened at the gate was wrong. It's about time these companies recognize that." She paused. "My husband went through something similar last year. No one from the airline ever apologized, let alone offered to change their policies." Marcus nodded, appreciating her support, but still processing the unexpected turn of events. He glanced down at Ranger, who looked up at him with steady brown eyes that seemed to say, "See, things can change." Around them, other passengers who had witnessed the video call began to murmur approvingly. The story spread through the cabin. The airline was apologizing, making amends, asking the veteran to help improve their policies. The mood shifted tangibly. What had begun as an incident of public humiliation was transforming into something else entirely, a moment of recognition, of correction, of potential positive change. The businessman who had complained earlier about the delay caught Marcus's eye briefly before looking away, his expression unreadable, but his previous indignation notably absent. Sandra returned with fresh water for both Marcus and Ranger. "Captain Reeves asked me to check if you need anything else." "Just to thank him," Marcus replied. "For everything." "You'll get your chance," she assured him. "He mentioned wanting to speak with you again before landing." As Sandra moved away, an elderly woman across the aisle leaned toward Marcus. "My Harold, my late husband, he served in Korea, came home with what they called shell shock back then. No service dogs, no proper treatment, just expected to get over it." She shook her head sadly. "What you're doing, helping them understand, it matters, not just for you, but for all of them." Marcus felt a weight in his chest, not the constricting pressure of anxiety, but something different, something like purpose. For 3 years since his medical discharge, he'd focused on survival, on managing his symptoms enough to function in civilian life. The idea of making a broader difference, of using his painful experiences to prevent others from facing the same obstacles, it hadn't seemed possible. Yet here was this opportunity, unexpected and profound, emerging from what had begun as just another humiliating episode in his ongoing struggle to navigate a world not designed for invisible wounds. Frank Delgado caught his eye and nodded, the simple gesture conveying volumes. From one generation of veterans to another, an acknowledgement of progress hard-won and long overdue. "The tide's turning, son," Frank said quietly. "Slow as molasses, but turning all the same." Marcus nodded, his hand finding Ranger's steady presence beside him. For the first time in longer than he could remember, he felt something that had been notably absent since Lieutenant Allen's blood had soaked through his uniform in that desert helicopter. Hope. Word of what had transpired continued to spread throughout the aircraft. The modern grapevine of social media accelerated the process, with passengers sending messages before the plane had even reached its destination. A college student, 3, rows behind Marcus, was the first to post about the incident. "I am watching a veteran with PTSD being defended by airline captain who recognized him from Afghanistan. Some real heroes on this flight. Respect our veterans." Another passenger shared a photo of Ranger lying calmly at Marcus's feet. "Service dogs save lives. This good boy just trying to do his job when Airline tried to separate him from his handler." Captain stepped in. Service Dogs at Work. The posts gained traction quickly, resonating with ongoing national conversations about veteran care and service animal access. By the time the flight reached the halfway point of its journey, the hashtag Chuck Cockpit door opened was trending in several cities. Sandra approached Marcus again, this time with a bemused expression. "You're becoming something of a celebrity, Sergeant Holloway?" Marcus looked up in confusion. "What do you mean?" She showed him her phone, scrolling through a feed of posts about the incident. "Social media is picking up the story. Our corporate communications team has already reached out to the crew for details." Marcus felt his chest tighten with familiar anxiety. Ranger immediately pressed closer, sensing the shift in his stress levels. "I didn't want attention," he said quietly, "just to travel with my dog." "Sometimes these things take on a life of their own," Sandra replied gently. "For what it's worth, the comments are overwhelmingly supportive. People are touched by Captain Reeves stepping in." Frank Delgado leaned across the aisle. "Welcome to the digital age, son. Everything's a story now." As if to prove his point, a flight attendant from the economy section approached, looking slightly uncomfortable. "Excuse me, Sergeant Holloway. I have some passengers in the back who are veterans. They've asked if they could come up and meet." "You and your service dog? I told them I'd have to check with you first." Marcus blinked in surprise. Sure. I guess that would be fine." Over the next 30 minutes, a steady stream of veterans made their way to the first-class cabin. A young woman who'd served as a medic in Iraq, an older man who'd been at Desert Storm, a middle-aged couple who had met while both serving in the Navy. Each had a story. Each expressed gratitude, not just for Marcus's service, but for bringing attention to the challenges veterans with invisible wounds faced daily. Several mentioned their own struggles with PTSD, anxiety, depression, the silent battles that continued long after discharge. One man in his 30s knelt to greet Ranger properly, clearly familiar with service dog protocols. "I'm on the waiting team list," he explained. 8 months so far. My therapist says it'll be another year, at least." "Worth the wait," Marcus assured him. "Ranger changed everything for me." "That's what keeps me going," the man replied. "Days when I can barely leave my apartment. I just think about having my own Ranger someday." As the impromptu gathering continued, flight attendants rearranged their service schedule to accommodate the steady flow of visitors to the first-class cabin. Far from being annoyed by the disruption, other first-class passengers appeared moved by the unfolding scene. Flight attendant from economy appeared with a leather-bound book. "We're collecting messages," she explained, "for both you and Captain Reeves. Just notes of support and thanks." The book was already half filled with handwritten messages. "Thank you for your service and for standing up for what's right. My son has PTSD. Thank you for making his path a little easier. To the captain and the sergeant, true American heroes." Marcus felt overwhelmed by the outpouring. For years, his PTSD had been a source of shame, something to hide or downplay. The validation from strangers, acknowledgement not just of his military service, but of his ongoing struggles, was profoundly disorienting, yet healing. Sandra returned with her tablet. "The stories reached the news now," she said, showing Marcus a local news website that had picked up the social media posts. The headline read, "Airline Captain Opens Cockpit Door, Stands Up for Veteran with PTSD." "This is a lot," Marcus admitted, his hand finding Ranger's fur for grounding. "It's important," Elena Wilson said firmly from behind him. "My husband has been fighting these same battles for years. Every time someone stands up, it makes a difference." The Vietnam veteran, Frank, nodded in agreement. "In my day, we kept it all bottled up. No one talked about what war did to your head. Just expected to suck it up." He gestured around at the gathered veterans. "This is better. Trust me." As the impromptu gathering continued, Marcus noticed another ripple effect. Passengers who had initially seemed uncomfortable around Ranger were now watching the service dog with interest and respect. Several asked thoughtful questions about service animal training and the differences between service dogs and emotional support animals. A mother used the moment to educate her young daughter. "See how the dog is working? That's why we never pets. Service dogs without permission. They're doing an important job." Sandra approached again, this time with a message from the cockpit. "Captain Reeves wanted me to tell you we're about an hour from landing, and—" she lowered her voice. "Corporate headquarters has been calling nonstop. Apparently, the story has caught the attention of several veteran advocacy groups." Marcus nodded, still processing the unexpected turn of events. What had begun as a personal humiliation was transforming into something much larger, a moment of public education, of collective support, of potential systemic change. For a man who had spent years feeling invisible despite his visible struggles, the sudden visibility was both overwhelming and strangely healing. Around him, a community had formed, not just of veterans, but of allies who recognized that some wounds couldn't be seen, but deserved to be acknowledged all the same. As the aircraft began its initial descent, James emerged from the cockpit for a final cabin check, a personal habit he'd maintained throughout his career, despite it not being required of captains. The practice connected him with passengers and crew, reinforcing that his responsibility extended beyond the technical operation of the aircraft to the human cargo entrusted to his care. He made his way through first class, nodding to passengers and checking that seatbelts were fastened. When he reached Marcus's row, he paused. "Doing all right, Sergeant?" he asked quietly. Marcus nodded. "Better than all right, sir." "Thank you." James glanced around at the now subdued cabin, noting the book of messages on the seat beside Marcus and the respectful distance other passengers were maintaining around the veteran and his service dog. "Looks like you've made some friends," he observed. "Apparently, we both have," Marcus replied, nodding toward the messages. "Your inbox is going to be full when we land." James smiled slightly. "Wouldn't be the first time." He hesitated, then made a decision. "Mind if I join you for a moment?" Marcus gestured to the empty aisle seat beside him. James sat down, removing his captain's hat and placing it on his knee. For a moment, neither man spoke, the ambient noise of the aircraft filling the silence. "There's something I want to explain," James finally said, his voice low enough that only Marcus could hear, "about why this flight was never going to leave without you and Ranger." Marcus waited, sensing the weight behind the captain's words. "Every flight I've commanded for the past 15 years has carried an empty seat," James began. "Not physically empty, we book it. Someone sits in it. But in my mind, that seat is reserved." He paused, collecting his thoughts. "It started after that night in Afghanistan, after Lieutenant Allen." Marcus stiffened slightly at the mention of his fallen team leader. Ranger, ever attentive, pressed closer to his leg. "When I transitioned to commercial aviation, I brought a habit with me," James continued. "On every flight manifest, I find one name, usually a young man about Allen's age, and I make that his seat. I check that passenger's destination, imagine who might be waiting for him, ensure he arrives safely." He met Marcus's gaze directly. "It's my way of bringing Lieutenant Allen home every single day, completing the mission that didn't end the way it should have." The simple confession hung between them, profound in its vulnerability. Marcus felt his throat tighten with emotion. "Today," James said, "when I saw you at that gate, when I recognized you, that seat became yours. And there was no way I was leaving that terminal without making sure you and Ranger got home safely." Marcus nodded, unable to speak immediately. The acknowledgement of their shared loss, of the invisible weight both men had carried since that night in the desert, created a moment of perfect understanding. "Lieutenant Allen would have appreciated that," Marcus finally managed. "He was always focused on getting his men home." "He was a good officer," James agreed. "Made the right call that night, asking for extraction despite the conditions. Saved your lives. Cost him his own," Marcus added quietly. James nodded, his expression solemn. "That's the burden of command. The calculations no training can truly prepare you for." They sat in silence for a moment, the aircraft beginning its descent toward Chicago. Around them, passengers secured loose items and returned seatbacks to their upright positions, unaware of the sacred conversation unfolding in their midst. "Never knew what happened to the pilot," Marcus finally said. After we landed, everything was chaos. Alan was gone. Davidson and I were rushed into surgery. By the time I was coherent enough to ask questions, the helicopter crew had returned to their unit. Standard procedure, James acknowledged. Mission completed, move on to the next. But it wasn't just another mission, Marcus pressed. What? You did that night? Coming back alone, landing in those conditions, under fire. It was beyond duty. James shook his head slightly. No, it was exactly duty. The purest form of it. He paused. My co-pilot, Lieutenant Rodriguez, had been hit badly in our first approach. His last words before losing consciousness were, "Go back for them." Not a request, an order. Did he make it? Marcus asked. He did. Traumatic brain injury, medical discharge, but he survived. Lives in Arizona now. Teaches high school math. James smiled faintly. We still talk every year on the anniversary. The announcement system chimed and Sandra's voice requested all crew to prepare for landing. James stood, replacing his captain's hat. I need to get back, he said. But I wanted you to know about the seat, about why today mattered. Marcus nodded, understanding completely. Thank you, Captain. Not just for today, for everything. Thank you for your service, Sergeant Holloway, James replied formally, then added more softly, It's good to finally bring you home properly. As James made his way back to the cockpit, Marcus watched him go, struck by the realization that sometimes rescue came in unexpected forms, years after the original extraction. Sometimes healing began with being truly seen, with having your invisible wounds acknowledged by someone who understood their depth. He placed his hand on Ranger's head, drawing strength from the dog's unwavering presence. Outside the window, the landscape of Chicago came into view, the city sprawling beneath them as they descended from the sky. Ranger looked up at him, brown eyes steady and alert, ready for whatever came next. For the first time in years, Marcus felt the same. The aircraft touched down in Chicago with textbook precision, a smooth landing that barely disturbed the passengers. As they taxied toward the gate, the usual rustling of preparation began, seatbelts unclicking, overhead bins being opened prematurely. Despite flight attendant instructions, the soft ping of cell phones being switched from airplane mode. Sandra's voice came over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Chicago O'Hare International Airport. Local time is 2:37 p.m. and the temperature is 72 degrees. Please remain seated until the captain has turned off the fastened seatbelt sign. A pause then. Before we deplane, we have a special request. Our passenger in 2A, Staff Sergeant Marcus Holloway and his service dog Ranger, will be exiting first. We ask that you remain seated to allow them clear passage. Thank you for your understanding and cooperation. Marcus felt his face flush at the unexpected announcement. Ranger sensed his handler's discomfort and pressed closer, providing steady pressure against his leg. Frank Delgado leaned across the aisle. Standard procedure for dignitaries, he said with a wink. Get used to it, son. The aircraft came to a complete stop at the gate. The seatbelt sign chimed off, and James's voice came over the intercom. This is Captain Reeves. On behalf of our entire flight crew, thank you for flying with Transcontinental today. As we prepare to deplane, I'd like to personally thank you all for your patience and understanding regarding our slightly delayed departure. Sometimes doing the right thing takes a few extra minutes. A murmur of approval rippled through the cabin. I'd also like to acknowledge the veterans who joined us today, James continued. Your service and sacrifice are not forgotten. To those still carrying invisible wounds of war, you are seen, you are valued, and you are not alone. Marcus felt a lump form in his throat at the unexpected acknowledgement. Around him, several passengers nodded in solemn agreement. Sandra appeared at his side. Ready when you are, Sergeant Holloway. Marcus gathered his small carry-on bag and nodded to Ranger, who immediately assumed his working position. As they rose to exit, something unexpected happened. The passengers began to applaud. The sound started in first class and rippled backward through the aircraft. Not a thunderous ovation, but a steady, respectful acknowledgement. The businessman who had complained earlier about the delay caught Marcus's eye and offered a nod of respect. The elderly woman who had spoken of her husband dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. Frank Delgado stood and offered a crisp salute. "Carry on, Sergeant," he said formally. Marcus returned the salute, military precision unchanged by the years since. His discharge. As he moved toward the exit, passengers reached out, not to touch him or Ranger, but to offer words of support, nods of acknowledgement, silent gestures of respect. One woman pressed a business card into his hand. "Veteran Services. Coordinator," she whispered. "Call if you need anything." At the aircraft door, the entire flight crew had assembled in a small honor guard. Sandra stood at the front, her professional demeanor softened by genuine emotion. "Thank you," she said simply, "for your service and for reminding us what matters." Marcus nodded, words failing him. He and Ranger stepped into the jetway, leaving behind an aircraft full of strangers who, for a brief moment, had become something like family. To his surprise, James was waiting in the jetway, having exited through the cockpit door. "Thought I'd walk you out," the captain said. "Make sure there are no issues with your connection." "I appreciate that," Marcus replied, "but I'm actually at my destination. My sister lives in Chicago." James nodded. "Good. Family's important." He hesitated, then asked, "She meeting you?" "She's supposed to be." Emily's usually pretty punctual. They walked together down the long jetway, an unlikely pair, the airline captain in his crisp uniform and the veteran with his service dog. Behind them, passengers had begun to deplane, maintaining a respectful distance. "I meant what I said back there," James said quietly, "about the invisible wounds. Too many of us carry them alone." "Ranger helps with that," Marcus replied, his hand finding the dog's head automatically, "makes the burden visible, manageable." They emerged from the jetway into the bustling terminal. A small crowd had gathered near the gate. Not the usual collection of waiting passengers, but a more organized assembly. Several wore military insignia or veteran organization patches. Some held small American flags. At the front stood a young woman with Marcus's eyes and smile, holding a hand-lettered sign that read, "Welcome home, Marcus and Ranger." Marcus froze, confusion evident on his face. "Emily, what is all this?" His sister stepped forward, embracing him tightly. "Your flight got attention, big brother. Someone recognized your name on social media, Tim from your therapy group. He called me and, she gestured to the assembled group. Word spread." A tall man in a Veterans Affairs jacket stepped forward. "Staff Sergeant Holloway, I'm Daniel Mercer, Chicago VA Outreach Coordinator. We wanted to be here to show our support." Another man nodded. "When we heard what happened at the gate and how the captain stepped in, it resonated with a lot of us. Too many veterans face these obstacles alone." Marcus turned to James, overwhelmed. "Did you know about this?" The captain shook his head, equally surprised. "Not a clue." Emily extended her hand to James. "You must be Captain Reeves. Thank you for standing up for my brother." James accepted her handshake with a modest nod, just doing what needed to be done. As the impromptu welcome party surrounded them, offering support and gratitude, Marcus felt something shift within him, a loosening of the isolation that had defined his post-military life. For years, he'd navigated a world that seemed indifferent to his struggles, fighting daily battles that few understood or acknowledged. But here, in this moment, he was seen. His challenges recognized, his service valued, not despite his wounds, but inclusive of them, the full measure of his sacrifice acknowledged at last. 3 months later, the training room at Transcontinental Airlines corporate headquarters buzzed with conversation as gate agents, flight attendants, and customer service representatives settled into their seats. At the front of the room, a projection screen displayed the company logo alongside the words "Service Animal Accommodation, New Protocols and Best Practices." Regina Matthews, the regional director who had called Marcus during the flight, stood at the podium reviewing her notes. Beside her, Michael Bradford, the COO, chatted quietly with James Reeves, now in civilian clothes, 3 months into his retirement. And next to James sat Marcus Holloway with Ranger calmly positioned at his feet. "If everyone could take their seats, we'll get started," Regina announced, bringing the room to order. "Thank you all for being here today for this important training session." The assembled airline staff focused their attention forward, many eyeing Ranger with interest. 3 months ago, an incident at one of our gates highlighted significant gaps in our service animal policies and staff training, Regina began. What could have been a PR disaster instead became an opportunity for meaningful change, thanks to the intervention of Captain James Reeves and the gracious engagement of Staff Sergeant Marcus Holloway. She gestured toward the two men, and a ripple of recognition moved through the audience. The story had received significant media attention, transforming from a local human interest piece to a national conversation about accessibility for veterans with invisible disabilities. Today marks the official implementation of our new Service Animal Accommodation Protocol, Regina continued. This comprehensive approach aligns fully with current Department of Transportation regulations while incorporating best practices developed in consultation with veteran advocacy groups and service dog training organizations. Bradford stepped forward. "As you all know, Transcontinental has always prided itself on supporting our military and veterans. But good intentions aren't enough if our practices create barriers. When Sergeant Holloway was initially denied boarding with his service dog despite having proper documentation, it revealed a disconnect between our stated values and our operational reality." He glanced at Marcus with genuine respect. Fortunately for us, Sergeant Holloway agreed to work with our policy team rather than simply filing a complaint. The results of that collaboration are what we're implementing today. Regina resumed the presentation, clicking through slides that outlined the new protocol. Key changes include clear differentiation between service animals and emotional support animals, elimination of the 48-hour advance documentation requirement for legitimate service animals, and a streamlined verification process that respects both the handler's privacy and our operational needs. She highlighted a particular slide. Perhaps most importantly, we've developed a purple folder system. She held up a purple file folder emblazoned with the company logo. When a passenger identifies themselves as traveling with a service animal, this folder will be used to collect and verify their documentation. The purple color signals to all staff that this is a service animal situation to be handled according to the new protocol. James leaned toward Marcus. "Purple smoke," he whispered, referencing the signal that had guided his helicopter to their position in Afghanistan. Marcus nodded, appreciating the parallel. The color choice had been his suggestion, a small but meaningful connection to that night in the desert, Regina continued. We've also established a designated service animal relief area at each of our hub airports, working in partnership with airport authorities to ensure these spaces are properly maintained and accessible. Bradford returned to the podium. "Now, I'd like to invite Captain Reeves to say a few words about the importance of this initiative. From a flight crew perspective," James approached the front, his posture still reflecting his military and aviation background, despite the civilian clothes. "Thank you, Michael. For 22 years, I served as a captain with Transcontinental. Before that, I flew rescue missions with the Air Force. In both roles, my primary responsibility was the same, to ensure the safety and well-being of every person entrusted to my care." He surveyed the room of airline staff. "As frontline representatives of this company, you share that responsibility. When a veteran with PTSD approaches your counter with a service dog, that animal isn't a pet or an accessory. It's medically necessary equipment as vital as an insulin pump or oxygen tank." The staff listened attentively, many nodding in agreement. The new protocols you're learning today aren't just about compliance with regulations. They're about recognizing that some wounds aren't visible, some needs aren't obvious, and some forms of assistance don't fit our traditional understanding of medical equipment. James gestured toward Marcus. "I'll now turn the floor over to Staff Sergeant Holloway, who has graciously agreed to share his perspective As a service dog handler, Marcus stood, Ranger moving smoothly to heel position beside him. He'd prepared for this moment, working with his therapist to manage the anxiety of public speaking. Ranger's steady presence beside him made it possible. "Thank you, Captain Reeves," he began, his voice gaining strength as he continued. "3 months ago, I was just trying to board a flight with my service dog. Today, I'm helping implement changes that will affect thousands of travelers with disabilities. That transformation wouldn't have been possible without a captain who was willing to open the cockpit door and stand up for what was right." He looked out at the assembled staff. "I'm not here to share war stories or discuss my personal struggles. I'm here to help you understand what a service animal means to someone with an invisible disability and how your actions can either create barriers or build bridges." For the next 15 minutes, Marcus explained the rigorous training service. Dogs undergo the specific tasks Ranger performed to mitigate his PTSD symptoms and the legal rights and responsibilities of service animal handlers. The staff asked thoughtful questions, engaged with the material, and several shared their own experiences with passengers requiring accommodations. As the formal presentation concluded, Bradford returned to the podium. "This new protocol will be implemented system-wide beginning next Monday. Each of you will receive comprehensive training materials and reference guides. But remember, at its core, this isn't about following procedures. It's about seeing the person behind the disability, recognizing their needs, and responding with dignity and respect." He gestured toward Marcus and James. "These gentlemen have agreed to be available for questions during the reception following this session. Please take advantage of their expertise and experience." As the formal presentation ended and staff members approached with questions, Marcus felt a sense of purpose that had been missing since his medical discharge. What had begun as a humiliating experience had transformed into an opportunity to create meaningful change, not just for himself, but for countless others who would travel these same airways, carrying invisible wounds of their own. 1 year later, Chicago O'Hare International Airport bustled with its usual controlled chaos, travelers rushing to gates, emotional reunions at arrivals, the constant hum of announcements echoing through the vast terminal. At Gate C-17, a flight from Denver was deplaning, passengers streaming into the terminal with the weary relief of journey's end. Near the customer service desk, Marcus Holloway stood in a navy blue vest emblazoned with Veteran Service Animal Advocate. Beside him, Ranger wore his own official vest, the dog's alert but calm demeanor a testament to his training. A small sign on the desk read, "Have questions about traveling with service animals? Ask me." "Excuse me," a young woman approached, anxiety evident in her tight posture. A German Shepherd mix in a service vest stayed close to her side. "I'm flying to Boston tomorrow, and I'm worried about the connection. My dog Bella helps with my anxiety, but I've never flown with her before." Marcus smiled reassuringly. "First, time can be stressful, but you're already doing everything right. May I see your documentation?" The woman handed over a folder, purple, matching the protocol Marcus had helped implement across multiple airlines. He reviewed the papers efficiently. "These look perfect," he confirmed. "When you check in, mention you're traveling with a service animal. They'll note it in your reservation and use this purple folder system to keep your documentation organized." Relief washed over the woman's face. "That's so much easier than what I was reading online about the process." "It's improved a lot recently," Marcus agreed. "Let me show you where the service animal relief areas are located for your connection." As Marcus provided guidance, James Reeves approached, dressed in casual clothes with a fishing hat tucked in his back pocket. His retirement was evidently agreeing with him. "Staff Sergeant," he greeted with a warm smile. "Right where you said you'd be." The two men shook hands, their initial connection having evolved into genuine friendship over the past year. "Captain," Marcus replied, "or should I say Mr. now?" "Just James is fine," he said with a chuckle. Though old habits die hard, Marcus finished helping the young woman, who thanked him profusely before continuing toward her gate, her service, dog moving confidently beside her. Another success story? James asked. Just doing what I wish someone had done for me, Marcus replied. How was the fishing trip? Spectacular. Northern Wisconsin is beautiful this time of year. James patted his pocket. Got photos to show you over lunch. Rodriguez joined me for a few days. You remember my co-pilot from that night? Marcus nodded. How is he? Good days and bad, like all of us. Teaching agrees with him. James glanced at his watch. Speaking of lunch, shall we head to the usual spot? Davidson's flight lands in 30 minutes. The mention of his former teammate brought a smile to Marcus's face. Still can't believe he's coming. Believe it, James replied. Your sister said he sounded nervous, but determined. They made their way through the terminal, Marcus occasionally pausing to answer questions from travelers or airport staff about service animals. His volunteer position had evolved into a part-time consulting role, working with airlines to improve their accessibility policies and training their staff on proper service animal protocols. Any word from Townsend? James asked as they walked. Marcus shook his head. Still deployed, but he sent an email last week. Said he's thinking about working with service dogs when he retires next year. The program we started made an impression. They reached a quieter area of the terminal where a small plaque had been installed 6 months earlier. Both men paused before it. In honor of Lieutenant Christopher Allen, 1981 to 2009, and all who serve, with invisible wounds, no one left behind, dedicated by Transcontinental Airlines and the Veteran Service Dog Alliance. Marcus touched the plaque briefly, a gesture of respect that had become ritual whenever they passed this spot. Ranger sat perfectly at attention beside him, as if understanding the significance. You know, James said quietly, when I hung up my captain's wings, I thought my days of making a difference were behind me. Funny how life works. You never stopped. Being a rescuer, Marcus replied, just changed how you did it. They continued to the airport restaurant, where they had established a monthly tradition, lunch with whoever from their extended network of veterans could join. Today would be special. Davidson was finally ready to leave his parents' basement, taking his first flight since medical discharge, coming to explore the service dog program Marcus had helped establish. As they settled at their usual corner table, Marcus checked his phone. Emily says she's picked Davidson up. They're on their way. James nodded, his expression thoughtful. Full circle, isn't it? From that night when everything fell apart to today, rebuilding piece by piece. Not the same as before, Marcus noted. We can't go back to who we were. No, James agreed, but forward is its own kind of victory. The restaurant door opened, and Marcus saw his sister enter with a man he barely recognized. Davidson had lost weight, cut his hair, stood straighter than the last time they'd met. He looked nervous but determined, scanning the restaurant until he spotted Marcus and James. For a moment, he hesitated at the threshold. Then, with visible resolve, he stepped forward. Ranger, sensing his handler's emotion, pressed against Marcus's leg, the steady presence that had made all of this possible. Marcus reached down, his hand finding the dog's warm fur, drawing strength from the connection that had saved him countless times. Ready? James asked quietly. Marcus nodded, rising to greet his long-lost brother in arms. Ready? As Davidson approached their table, Marcus saw the shadow of that night in Afghanistan still lingering in his eyes. But there was something else there, too, something that looked remarkably like hope. Some extractions took years rather than minutes. Some rescues happened in airport terminals rather than desert landing zones. Some wounds healed differently than others, but healed nonetheless. And sometimes the most important cockpit door to open was the one that led not to an aircraft's controls, but to understanding, compassion, and the recognition that no warrior should ever have to fight their battles alone.